"Stop right there! You're interfering with a federal police investigation." The command echoed through Chicago Police Headquarters as Commissioner Vincent Fletcher shoved the young black woman against the concrete wall. 26-year-old Maya Maxwell hit the ground hard, her federal briefcase bursting open, scattering documents marked Classified Department of Justice. Officers stepped back, some recording, others whispering about another routine security incident. Just another case of someone being where they didn't belong, but what none of them knew would destroy everything. The woman bleeding on the headquarters floor wasn't just any civil rights attorney. The papers scattered around her weren't just any federal documents. And the commissioner standing over her wasn't just any racist cop. As Maya slowly stood, her federal prosecutor badge now clearly visible, something shifted in the air. When she looked directly at Vincent, there was recognition in her eyes that made his authoritative smirk crumble. "Hello, Dad," she said quietly. "Grace is going to be heartbroken." The police headquarters fell silent. Vincent's face went white. Because the family secret that was about to emerge would destroy not just his career, but everything he thought he knew about justice, family, and the price of hatred. What happened next would expose recorded evidence so damning it would transform federal police oversight forever. Believe that racist language has no place in our justice system. Type justice below. The morning of September 22nd started like any other at the Chicago Police Headquarters. Officers hurried through the steel corridors with their case files, detectives maintained their investigations, and the wheels of law enforcement turned with their usual procedural precision. Maya Maxwell walked through the main entrance at exactly 9:15 a.m., her charcoal business suit impeccable, her federal briefcase containing what would become the most important police corruption case of the decade. At 26, she had already established herself as one of the Justice Department's most formidable civil rights prosecutors, specializing in cases of police brutality and institutional racism. But Commissioner Vincent Fletcher saw none of that. What he saw was a young black woman in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase through his police headquarters. What he saw was someone who, in his warped worldview, didn't belong in these halls of law enforcement authority. What he saw was an opportunity to assert the power that had been protecting him for 22 years. "Excuse me," Vincent called out, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Where do you think you're going?" Maya paused, turning with the professional courtesy she had learned to maintain even in the face of obvious discrimination. "I have federal documents to deliver to Captain Rodriguez regarding an ongoing civil rights investigation," she replied calmly, holding up her Justice Department credentials. Vincent barely glanced at the badge. In his mind, he had already categorized her, already decided her fate. "That's a restricted area. You can't just walk around here like you own the place." The other officers began to notice the interaction. Some slowed their pace, curious about what appeared to be another routine security confrontation. Others deliberately looked away, recognizing the familiar pattern of Vincent asserting dominance over someone he deemed inferior. "I'm a federal civil rights prosecutor," Maya explained, her voice remaining steady despite the growing tension. "I have every right to access Captain Rodriguez's office for this investigation." But Vincent's worldview didn't allow for the possibility that this young black woman could hold such a position. In his racist mindset, she had to be lying, had to be some kind of activist or troublemaker trying to gain access to areas she didn't belong. "Federal prosecutor?" Vincent's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Right. And I'm the Attorney General. Nice try, sweetheart, but you're going to have to try that scam somewhere else." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. In that moment, she realized that her credentials, her education, her years of dedication to justice meant nothing to this man. She was simply another black person to be controlled, dismissed, and humiliated. "Sir, I can provide additional identification if you need to verify my—" "What I need," Vincent interrupted, his voice rising, "is for you to stop wasting my time and get out of this building before I have you arrested for interfering with police operations." The headquarters had grown quieter now, other conversations stopping as people began to realize something significant was happening. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that this interaction might be worth recording. Maya took a deep breath, her training in de-escalation kicking in. She had dealt with hostile law enforcement before, had navigated countless situations where her authority was questioned solely because of her race. But something about Vincent's aggressive posture, his complete dismissal of her credentials, felt different, more personal, more dangerous. "Commissioner Fletcher," she said, reading his nameplate, "I understand you're concerned about security, but I need you to understand that I'm here on official Justice Department business. I have a time-sensitive investigation that could impact thousands of citizens. Please allow me to proceed to Captain Rodriguez's office." The mention of his name seemed to trigger something in Vincent. The idea that this woman knew who he was, that she was treating him like someone accountable rather than the ultimate authority he believed himself to be, pushed him over the edge. "That's enough," he shouted, moving closer to Maya. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it ends now." What happened next would change everything. But what they didn't know about the woman on the floor would expose a corruption so deep it would shock the nation. 3 hours earlier, in her downtown Chicago office, Maya Maxwell had been putting the finishing touches on the most important investigation of her career. The documents that now lay scattered across the police headquarters floor represented 18 months of meticulous investigation, hundreds of interviews, and thousands of pages of evidence. The case was United States vs. Chicago Police Department, Special Corruption Unit, a comprehensive federal investigation that would challenge decades of racially biased policing practices and systematic cover-ups. Maya had compiled evidence of discriminatory enforcement, excessive force used disproportionately against Black and Latino citizens, and a culture of impunity that protected officers who engaged in brutal and racist behavior. Her phone had buzzed with a text from Captain Elena Rodriguez. "New evidence came in overnight. Need federal review ASAP. This changes everything about the Fletcher investigation." Maya had quickly gathered her materials, knowing that this breakthrough could be the key to exposing corruption that reached the highest levels of the Chicago Police Department. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let procedural obstacles stand in her way. Now, as Commissioner Vincent Fletcher loomed over her in the headquarters corridor, those same materials lay scattered around her feet like evidence of a crime in progress. But Vincent saw only what his prejudices allowed him to see, another black person who needed to be put in their place. "You want to play games?" Vincent snarled, his hand moving toward his radio. "Let's see how you like explaining yourself in a holding cell." "Commissioner, please," Maya said, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I'm not playing any games. I'm a federal prosecutor with the Civil Rights Division. My badge number is—" "Enough!" Vincent cut her off, his face reddening with anger. "I've heard enough lies for one morning." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Some were police staff who recognized the familiar pattern of Vincent's aggressive behavior toward people of color. Others were federal agents and attorneys who sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented. Among them was Detective Sarah Kim, a 15-year veteran who had graduated from Northwestern Law School before joining the force. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized Maya from civil rights conferences, understanding immediately that Vincent was making a catastrophic mistake. "Commissioner," Sarah called out, stepping forward, "you need to stop, right now." "Stay out of this, Kim," Vincent snapped without taking his eyes off Maya. "This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength. "Because you're harassing a federal prosecutor who's investigating police corruption." Vincent finally turned, his expression confused and angry. "What are you talking about?" "Her name is Maya Maxwell," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly through the corridor. "She's with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. And if you don't back down right now, you're going to be the one in federal custody." A murmur ran through the crowd as people began to understand what was happening. Phones came out, recording devices activated, and the casual observers transformed into potential witnesses to a federal civil rights violation. Vincent's confidence wavered for the first time. He looked from Sarah to Maya, his mind trying to process information that contradicted everything his prejudices had told him about the situation. "That's impossible," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "She's just some—" He stopped himself before completing the racist thought, but everyone present understood what he had been about to say. Maya slowly stood up, brushing dust from her suit and checking her briefcase for damage. When she looked at Vincent again, there was something different in her eyes. The professional courtesy was gone, replaced by the cold calculation of someone who had just witnessed their civil rights being violated by a federal employee. "Commissioner Fletcher," she said, her voice now carrying the authority that came with years of prosecuting civil rights cases, "you have just committed a federal crime. You have violated my civil rights under color of law, and you have interfered with an official Justice Department investigation." Vincent's face went pale as the implications began to sink in. Around him, the police staff and visitors watched in stunned silence as they realized they had just witnessed a career-ending mistake, but none of them knew that the worst was yet to come. What she carried in that briefcase would expose systematic corruption that reached the very top of the police hierarchy. As news of the incident spread through the police headquarters, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. This wasn't Commissioner Vincent Fletcher's first time targeting a person of color. It wasn't even his first time this month. Detective Maria Santos had been working at the Chicago Police Department for 12 years, and she had seen Vincent's behavior escalate gradually over time. What had started as casual comments and jokes had evolved into increasingly aggressive confrontations with Black and Latino citizens, attorneys, and even fellow officers. "He's done this before," Maria whispered to her partner as they watched Maya gather her scattered papers. "Remember last month with Attorney Washington and that federal agent from Internal Affairs?" The memories came flooding back. Attorney Marcus Washington, a respected civil rights lawyer, had been questioned and detained for 40 minutes while Vincent verified his credentials. The federal agent, Lisa Chen, had been prevented from accessing evidence files until a federal judge intervened on her behalf. Each incident had been reported. Each report had been filed. Each file had been quietly archived by the police administration, swept under the rug of institutional indifference. Vincent had learned that his behavior would be tolerated, even protected, as long as he didn't cross certain lines. He had become emboldened by the system's failure to hold him accountable, confident that his position and connections would shield him from consequences. But Maya Maxwell was different. As a federal prosecutor specializing in police corruption, she understood exactly what Vincent's pattern of behavior represented. She recognized the systematic nature of his discrimination, the way his actions fit into a broader pattern of institutional racism that she had spent her career fighting. "Commissioner Fletcher," Maya said, her voice cutting through the headquarters' nervous chatter, "how many federal agents and attorneys have you harassed in this building in the past 6 months?" Vincent's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The question was simple, but its implications were devastating. Around him, police staff began to exchange nervous glances as they realized someone was finally asking the questions they had all been avoiding. I conduct security checks when the situation requires it," Vincent stammered. "Security checks," Maya repeated, her prosecutorial instincts fully engaged now. "And how do you determine who represents a security threat? What specific criteria do you use?" The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone present understood that there was no good answer to that question, no response that wouldn't expose the racial bias underlying Vincent's actions. "I think we should all calm down," attempted Deputy Chief Robert Sterling, a senior administrator who had materialized from his office upon hearing about the incident. "This seems to be a simple misunderstanding that we can resolve quietly." Maya turned her attention to Sterling, recognizing the type immediately. He was an institutional protector, someone whose primary concern was maintaining the status quo and avoiding negative publicity. "A simple misunderstanding," Maya's voice carried a prosecutor's skepticism. "Deputy Chief Sterling, are you aware that Commissioner Fletcher has a documented history of targeting federal agents and attorneys of color in this building?" Sterling's face flushed. "I'm not aware of any documented pattern of—" "Then you haven't been doing your job," Maya interrupted. "Because the documentation exists, the complaints exist, the witnesses exist. What doesn't exist is accountability." The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger now, drawn by the intensity of the confrontation and the realization that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Never before had someone challenged the police department's culture of willful blindness with such direct, unflinching clarity. Vincent looked around desperately, seeking support from colleagues who had always enabled his behavior. But now, faced with a federal prosecutor who understood exactly what she was dealing with, those same colleagues began to step back, distancing themselves from his actions. "This is ridiculous," Vincent said, his voice rising again as panic began to set in. "I was just doing my job. I had no way of knowing she looked like—" Again he stopped himself before completing the racist thought, but the damage was done. Everyone present understood exactly what he meant, exactly how his warped worldview categorized people based on their appearance rather than their credentials or character. Maya picked up her briefcase, checking to ensure that her crucial investigation documents were intact. The evidence that would reshape police accountability was unharmed, but something else had been damaged irreparably. The illusion that Vincent's behavior was acceptable, tolerable, or normal. "Commissioner Fletcher," Maya said, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "you have 30 seconds to decide whether you want to apologize and step aside, or whether you want to continue this interaction and face the full consequences of your actions." Vincent's radio crackled to life, the routine chatter of police communications suddenly seeming ominous in the charged atmosphere. He reached for it instinctively, and what happened next would shatter everything he thought he knew about power, privilege, and protection. But the truth about who she really was couldn't stay hidden. The crowd parted as Captain Elena Rodriguez emerged from the Internal Affairs Division, drawn by the commotion in the normally quiet police headquarters corridor. At 45, Captain Rodriguez commanded respect through both her position and her reputation for integrity. She had been investigating police corruption for 8 years, and she recognized the sound of a cover-up crumbling when she heard it. What exactly is going on here? Captain Rodriguez's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through departmental politics to find the truth. Vincent straightened automatically, his training kicking in despite his panic. "Captain, I was conducting a routine security screening when this individual became hostile and—" "Captain," Maya interrupted, her voice calm but firm, "I'm Federal Prosecutor Maya Maxwell with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. I was attempting to deliver classified documents to you when Commissioner Fletcher physically assaulted me based on what appears to be racial profiling." Captain Rodriguez's eyes moved from Maya to Vincent, taking in the scattered papers, the defensive posture of the commissioner, and the tense faces of the surrounding crowd. Her expression grew increasingly grave as she processed the implications. "Ms. Maxwell," Captain Rodriguez said carefully, "could you please show me your credentials?" Maya reached into her jacket and produced her federal badge and identification. Captain Rodriguez examined them thoroughly, her face darkening as she confirmed what she already suspected. "Commissioner Fletcher," Captain Rodriguez's voice had taken on the icy tone reserved for the most serious violations, "did you verify Ms. Maxwell's credentials before detaining her?" Vincent's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. I asked for identification, but she was being evasive and—" "That's a lie," said Detective Sarah Kim, stepping forward again. "I witnessed the entire interaction. Ms. Maxwell repeatedly identified herself as a federal prosecutor and attempted to show her credentials. Commissioner Fletcher refused to look at them." Captain Rodriguez turned to address the growing crowd of witnesses. "Did anyone else observe this interaction?" Several hands went up, including police staff members who had been too intimidated to speak up during the confrontation, but now felt emboldened by the captain's presence. "She told him at least 3 times that she was a federal prosecutor," said Officer Jennifer Walsh. "He kept interrupting her and wouldn't let her finish. He called her sweetheart and said she was running some kind of scam," added Dr. Marcus Thompson, a forensic psychologist who had been in the headquarters for an expert witness consultation. Each testimony was another nail in Vincent's coffin, but the full scope of his mistake was only beginning to emerge. Captain Rodriguez looked down at the papers scattered around Maya's feet, noting the classified markings and recognizing the official Justice Department formatting. "Ms. Maxwell, what was the nature of the documents you were delivering?" "United States versus Chicago Police Department," Special Corruption Unit, Maya replied. A comprehensive federal investigation addressing systematic discrimination and excessive force. The documents contain evidence of violations that have impacted thousands of citizens over the past decade. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd as people began to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or poor judgment. This was a federal civil rights prosecutor being assaulted while attempting to deliver evidence of police corruption by a commissioner whose own behavior exemplified exactly the kind of institutional racism the investigation was designed to address. Captain Rodriguez's face had gone ashen. In her 8 years investigating police corruption, she had never encountered such a clear-cut case of irony and injustice intersecting in such a dramatic fashion. "Commissioner Fletcher," Captain Rodriguez said, her voice barely controlled, "do you understand what you have done?" Vincent looked around desperately, seeking some escape from the nightmare his morning had become. The colleagues who had always supported his aggressive tactics were nowhere to be found. The administrators who had always buried complaints against him were suddenly unavailable. He was alone, exposed, and facing the consequences of years of protected racism. "I was just following protocol," Vincent said weakly. "Protocol?" Captain Rodriguez's voice rose. "What protocol involves physically assaulting a federal prosecutor without verifying their credentials? What protocol involves racial profiling in a police headquarters?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one highlighting another aspect of Vincent's misconduct. But even as the captain spoke, none of them knew that the most shocking revelation was still to come. Maya bent down to collect the last of her scattered papers, her movements careful and deliberate. As she straightened, she looked directly at Vincent, and something in her expression made him take an involuntary step backward. "Commissioner Fletcher," she said quietly, "before this goes any further, I think you should know something. I'm not just any federal prosecutor investigating police corruption. I'm the prosecutor who has been specifically investigating systematic civil rights violations by the Chicago Police Department for the past 18 months. And your behavior today has just provided me with a perfect case study." Vincent's face went white as the implications sank in. He wasn't just facing disciplinary action for a single incident. He was facing the full weight of a federal civil rights investigation, led by someone who specialized in prosecuting exactly the kind of behavior he had just displayed. But even that revelation paled in comparison to what investigators would discover when they pulled his communications records. What they found in his radio transmissions would destroy everything they thought they knew. Within 90 minutes of the incident, the police headquarters Internal Affairs Division had been activated, and federal investigators were en route from the Justice Department's Office of Inspector General. What had started as a single incident of racial profiling was rapidly escalating into a comprehensive investigation of civil rights violations. Special Agent Patricia Williams had spent 14 years investigating misconduct by federal and local law enforcement, but she had rarely encountered a case with such clear-cut evidence and such significant implications. The assault on Maya Maxwell wasn't just a civil rights violation, it was an attack on the integrity of the federal justice system itself. "We need to secure all radio communications from the police department's digital system," Agent Williams instructed her team. "Personnel files, incident reports, witness statements, everything. And I want Commissioner Fletcher's complete communication history, including any previous complaints or disciplinary actions." The initial review of headquarters security footage confirmed what witnesses had reported. The cameras clearly showed Vincent approaching Maya aggressively, refusing to examine her credentials, and physically shoving her against the wall. The audio quality was sufficient to capture his dismissive and condescending tone, though not clear enough to pick up every word. But it was the radio communications that would prove most damaging. Every police officer at the headquarters carried a digital radio that automatically recorded all transmissions. The recordings were archived for 60 days as a matter of routine security protocol. What investigators found in Vincent's radio files would transform the case from misconduct to a federal hate crime. "Pull everything from the past 2 months, Agent Williams ordered. "I want to know exactly what Commissioner Fletcher was thinking and saying before, during and after this incident. As technicians worked to isolate and enhance the audio files, the scope of the investigation continued to expand. Vincent's personnel file revealed a troubling pattern of complaints that had been filed, investigated superficially, and then buried by police administration. Complaint number 1. Federal agent Marcus Washington reported being detained and questioned for 40 minutes, while Vincent verified credentials that were clearly valid. Complaint number 2. Northwestern law professor Dr. Lisa Chen reported being prevented from accessing case files until a federal judge intervened. Complaint number 3. Civil rights attorney Sarah Johnson reported being questioned about her right to be in restricted areas despite having worked with the department for 5 years. Each complaint followed the same pattern: initial reporting, perfunctory investigation, and administrative burial. The police department's leadership had created a system that protected Vincent's racist behavior while silencing his victims. But this time would be different. "Agent Williams," called technical specialist James Martinez from across the room, "you need to hear this." Martinez had isolated audio from Vincent's radio transmission at 9:11 a.m., just 4 minutes before his confrontation with Maya. The quality was crystal clear, and the content was devastating. The voice was unmistakably Commissioner Vincent Fletcher's, speaking to another officer about the situation he was about to handle in the headquarters corridor. What they heard next would end Vincent's career instantly and provide ironclad evidence for federal hate crime charges. Agent Williams' face went pale as she listened to the recording. In her 14 years of investigating federal misconduct, she had never encountered evidence so damning, so explicitly racist, and so perfectly preserved by the perpetrator's own communication system. "We need to notify the U.S. Attorney's office immediately," Agent Williams said, "and we need to contact Maya Maxwell. She's going to want to hear this." But even as investigators celebrated their discovery of ironclad evidence, none of them suspected that a much more personal revelation was about to emerge. The family connections that would soon be exposed would add layers of complexity and heartbreak to a case that was already reshaping federal civil rights law. In her office at the Justice Department, Maya was reviewing her case files when her phone rang with a call that would change everything she thought she knew about the man who had assaulted her. What they found in the audio files would end his career forever. The federal building's conference room fell silent as Agent Williams pressed play on the digital audio recording. Maya Maxwell, her attorney, Captain Rodriguez, and several Justice Department officials leaned forward, preparing to hear evidence that would define the rest of Vincent Fletcher's life. The timestamp showed 9:11 a.m., exactly 4 minutes before Vincent confronted Maya in the police headquarters corridor. His voice was clear, confident, and utterly damning. "Hey, Rodriguez, I got a situation developing in the main corridor." Vincent's voice crackled through the speakers. Young black female, expensive suit, briefcase, acting like she owns the place. Looks like another one of those federal activists trying to sneak into restricted areas. There was a pause, then another officer's voice. "You want backup?" "Nah, I got this," Vincent replied. "Time to teach another one of these people some respect. I'm going to show this little racial slur exactly where she belongs in my police headquarters." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room understood they had just heard a police commissioner explicitly state his intention to commit a racially motivated assault using language so vile that it left no doubt about his motivations. But Vincent wasn't finished. "I'm so tired of these racial slur thinking they can just walk around here like they're somebody important," his voice continued. "Time to remind her what happens when you step out of line in my department." Agent Williams stopped the recording. "There's more, but I think you get the idea." Maya sat in stunned silence, processing what she had just heard. As a civil rights prosecutor, she had encountered racism in many forms, but rarely had she seen evidence so explicit and so perfectly preserved by the perpetrator himself. "He recorded his own confession," she said finally. 4 minutes before the assault, he explicitly stated his intention to target me because of my race." Captain Rodriguez shook her head in disbelief. "In 25 years with the department, I've never seen anything like this. He's created ironclad evidence of premeditation, racial motivation, and federal civil rights violations." The implications were staggering. What had initially appeared to be a case of poor judgment or unconscious bias was now revealed as deliberate, premeditated racial harassment. Vincent hadn't made a mistake. He had planned and executed a racially motivated assault on a federal prosecutor. "This transforms everything," said Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, who had been assigned to prosecute the case. "We're no longer looking at misconduct or civil rights violations. This is a federal hate crime with ironclad evidence of premeditation." Agent Williams nodded grimly. The recording also establishes pattern and practice. He refers to "these people" and another one, indicating this isn't an isolated incident, but part of ongoing discriminatory behavior. Maya stood and walked to the conference room window, looking out at the Chicago skyline as she processed the revelation. She had spent her career fighting institutional racism, but it was rare to encounter evidence so blatant and so perfectly documented. "There's something else," Agent Williams continued. "The technical analysis shows that Commissioner Fletcher has made similar comments on at least 8 other occasions in the past 2 months. He's been using racial slurs and expressing racist views on official police communication channels." The room erupted in shocked murmurs as the full scope of Vincent's recorded bigotry became clear. He hadn't just assaulted Maya, he had been conducting a campaign of racist harassment using federal resources and equipment. "How is this possible?" Captain Rodriguez asked. "How does someone like this remain in law enforcement?" "That's what we're investigating," Agent Williams replied. "But it appears there's been a systematic failure of oversight and accountability. Multiple complaints were filed and ignored. Supervisors either didn't review the radio recordings or chose to ignore them." Maya turned back to face the room. "This isn't just about Vincent Fletcher anymore. This is about the system that protected him, enabled him, and gave him the confidence to record his own racist statements on official police communication channels." The case was rapidly evolving from an individual incident into a comprehensive investigation of institutional failure. But none of them knew that the most shocking revelation was still to come. As Agent Williams prepared to brief them on the next phase of the investigation, her phone rang with a call from the police personnel office. The caller had information about Vincent Fletcher's background that would add an unimaginable personal dimension to the case. "Agent Williams," the voice said, "we've been reviewing Commissioner Fletcher's emergency contact information, and we found something you need to know about. His emergency contact is listed as Grace Maxwell. She's listed as his wife and Maya Maxwell's adoptive mother." Agent Williams' face went white as she processed the implications. She looked across the room at Maya, who was reviewing case documents and had no idea that her world was about to be shattered. The family secret that was about to emerge would transform this case from a matter of justice into a question of whether love and loyalty could survive the destructive power of racism. But no one was prepared for the family secret that would surface. Agent Williams excused herself from the conference room, her mind reeling from the information she had just received. In the hallway outside, she called the police personnel office to verify what seemed impossible. "Are you certain about this information?" she asked. "Absolutely," replied Personnel Director Janet Morris. "Grace Maxwell has been listed as Vincent Fletcher's wife and emergency contact for 22 years. Maya Maxwell is listed as his stepdaughter in the family information section. We also have documentation showing that Grace provided a character reference when Vincent was promoted to commissioner." Agent Williams closed her eyes, trying to process the implications. The federal prosecutor who had been assaulted by Vincent Fletcher was the stepdaughter of the man who had attacked her. The family that had raised Maya to fight for civil rights had somehow also sheltered someone who became a violent racist. "Agent Williams," came a voice from behind her. She turned to see Dr. Patricia Johnson, a forensic psychologist who had been consulting on the case. "Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Dr. Johnson, I need your expertise," Agent Williams said. "What would cause someone raised in an anti-racist household to develop such extreme racist views?" Dr. Johnson considered the question carefully. "There are several possibilities. Rebellion against family values, exposure to racist influences in law enforcement, underlying psychological issues that manifest as racial hatred. But without knowing the specific family dynamics, it's difficult to say." Agent Williams took a deep breath, knowing she was about to reveal information that would complicate everything. Dr. Johnson, the family in question is the Maxwell family. Grace Maxwell raised both the victim and the perpetrator in this case. Dr. Johnson's eyes widened in shock. You're telling me that Maya Maxwell and Vincent Fletcher are family members? That Grace Maxwell raised both a federal civil rights prosecutor and a violent racist police commissioner? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Agent Williams confirmed. And now I have to figure out how to break this news to Maya, and more importantly, how to handle the investigation when the victim and perpetrator are family members. The implications were staggering. The case was no longer just about racial profiling and civil rights violations. It was about family betrayal, the failure of love to overcome hatred, and the devastating personal cost of institutional racism. Back in the conference room, Maya was reviewing the audio evidence when her phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. Saw the news about an incident at the police headquarters. Are you okay? Call me when you can. Maya smiled slightly, touched by her mother's concern but not wanting to worry her with the details of what had happened. Grace Maxwell had spent her life fighting for civil rights and social justice, first as a young activist during the civil rights movement, and later as a community organizer and counselor. She had raised Maya to believe in the power of the law to create positive change, even in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. What Maya didn't know was that Grace had also raised someone else with those same values, someone who had rejected everything she tried to teach him about equality, respect, and human dignity. Agent Williams returned to the conference room, her expression grave. Ms. Maxwell, I need to speak with you privately. There's been a development in the case that you need to know about before we proceed. Maya followed Agent Williams to a smaller conference room down the hall, noting the agent's obvious discomfort. What's wrong? Did you find more evidence against Fletcher? In a manner of speaking, Agent Williams replied carefully. Ms. Maxwell, when we were reviewing Commissioner Fletcher's personnel file, we discovered some information about his background that directly relates to you. Maya's stomach tightened. What kind of information? Agent Williams sat down across from Maya, her voice gentle but direct. Vincent Fletcher's emergency contact is listed as Grace Maxwell. She's listed as his wife and you're listed as his stepdaughter. Ms. Maxwell, Vincent Fletcher is your stepfather. The words hit Maya like a physical blow. She stared at Agent Williams in disbelief, her mind struggling to process information that seemed impossible to reconcile with everything she knew about her family. That's not possible, Maya said finally. My mother has been married to Vincent for 22 years, but I've been away at college and law school. I barely know him. He's just someone who was there. According to the records, you were listed as living away from home during your education, Agent Williams explained. Vincent's career kept him busy, and it appears you had minimal interaction during family visits. The documentation shows that Grace has been proud of both your legal career and Vincent's law enforcement career. Maya's mind raced back through her memories, trying to recall the few interactions she'd had with Vincent during holiday visits home. He had always been distant, professional, polite, but cold. She had attributed it to the typical awkwardness between step-parent and adult stepchild. She had no idea that his coldness masked a deep racial hatred that would eventually explode into violence against her. He was quiet during family dinners, Maya said slowly, the pieces beginning to fit together. He never seemed interested in my civil rights work. Mom would talk about my cases, and he would just change the subject. The realization was devastating. Grace Maxwell, who had dedicated her life to fighting racism and inequality, had been married to a man who embodied everything she had spent her life opposing. Ms. Maxwell, Agent Williams said gently, this doesn't change the facts of the case. Vincent Fletcher committed a federal crime when he assaulted you. The audio evidence makes his guilt indisputable. But I wanted you to know about the family connection before you had to hear it from someone else. Maya sat in stunned silence, processing the implications. The man who had attacked her, who had used racial slurs and threatened her with violence, was someone her mother had loved and trusted for over 2 decades. Someone who had sat at their dinner table, participated in family celebrations, and pretended to share their values while harboring violent racist hatred. Does he know? Maya asked. Does Vincent know who I am? Agent Williams nodded grimly. Based on your recognition of each other at the headquarters, when you said Grace is going to be heartbroken, it appears he knew exactly who you were, which makes his actions even more reprehensible. He didn't just assault a federal prosecutor because of her race. He assaulted his stepdaughter. The personal betrayal added another layer of trauma to an already devastating situation. Vincent hadn't just violated Maya's civil rights. He had betrayed the woman who had married him, the family that had welcomed him, and the values that had been offered to him as gifts. We need to contact Grace, Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. She has a right to know what's happening before this becomes public. Agent Williams agreed. But Ms. Maxwell, you should also know that this revelation doesn't diminish the strength of our case. If anything, it makes Vincent's behavior more inexcusable. He can't claim ignorance or misunderstanding. He knew exactly who you were, what you represented, and what his actions would cost everyone involved. As the two women prepared to make the most difficult phone call of their lives, neither could imagine the depth of pain that was about to unfold. Grace Maxwell was about to discover that her life's work, raising a daughter to fight against racism while building a marriage she thought was based on shared values, had been built on a foundation of lies and hatred. The family secret that was about to emerge would test the very foundations of love, loyalty, and the possibility of redemption in the face of unforgivable betrayal. Stories of courage like Grace's inspire people all around the world. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages of choosing justice over family loyalty are reaching. Grace Maxwell was organizing case files at the Chicago Community Legal Aid Center when her phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and saw Maya's name, expecting to hear details about the police headquarters incident she had seen mentioned on the local news. Maya, sweetheart, I've been worried about you, Grace said, her voice warm with maternal concern. I saw something on the news about an incident at police headquarters. Are you all right? There was a long pause before Maya responded, and Grace immediately sensed that something was seriously wrong. Mom, I need you to sit down. There's something I have to tell you, and it's going to be very difficult to hear. Grace's heart began to race. In her 58 years, she had received many difficult phone calls, notifications about civil rights workers being beaten, news of setbacks in the fight for equality, reports of young people from her community getting into trouble. But something in Maya's tone suggested this was different, more personal. What's wrong, baby? Grace asked, settling into her office chair. Mom, the officer who attacked me today. It was Vincent. Commissioner Vincent Fletcher. The name hit Grace like a sledgehammer. She dropped the files she'd been holding, papers scattering across her desk as her mind struggled to process what she had just heard. That's not possible, Grace whispered. Vincent would never, he wouldn't hurt you. He knows you're his stepdaughter. The silence that followed confirmed Grace's worst fears. The man she had loved and trusted for 22 years, the partner she had believed shared her commitment to justice and equality, had become the very thing she had spent her life fighting against. Mom, there's more, Maya continued, her voice breaking. We have audio recordings of him planning the attack. He used racial slurs, Mom. He called me things that I can't repeat. He knew exactly who I was, and he attacked me anyway. Grace began to sob, great heaving sounds of grief that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. 22 years of love, trust, partnership, and shared dreams had been shattered in a single moment of racist violence. I don't understand, Grace cried. I lived with him for over 2 decades. I shared my bed with him, my dreams with him, my commitment to civil rights with him. How could he have hidden such hatred from me for so long? The question hung in the air like an accusation, not just of Vincent but of Grace herself. She had failed to see the truth about someone she loved, failed to protect her daughter from someone she had welcomed into their family. Maya's heart broke for her mother, understanding the depth of Grace's pain and self-blame. Mom, this isn't your fault. Vincent chose to hide his true beliefs from you. He chose to live a lie for 22 years. You gave him love, showed him a different way to live, believed in the possibility of goodness in everyone. He chose to reject all of that. But Grace's grief was inconsolable. She remembered their wedding day, when Vincent had promised to love and protect her family. She remembered the quiet evenings when he seemed to listen respectfully to her stories about civil rights work. She remembered believing that she had found a partner who shared her values and commitment to justice. "I remember when you graduated from law school," Grace said through her tears. "He seemed so proud. He said you were going to make a real difference in the world. How did that man become someone who would attack you with racial hatred?" The transformation was a mystery that would haunt Grace for the rest of her life. Somewhere along the way, Vincent had encountered influences that were stronger than her love, more persuasive than her teachings, more appealing than the values she had tried to share. "Mom, I need you to know something else," Maya said gently. "The case I was filing today, the federal investigation into police corruption, it's going to proceed, and Vincent's actions are going to become part of the evidence. This is going to be public, and it's going to be painful for our family." Grace understood the implications immediately. Her personal tragedy was about to become a matter of public record, a case study in the failure of love to overcome the persistent poison of institutional racism. "What do you need from me?" Grace asked, wiping her eyes and summoning the strength that had sustained her through decades of civil rights work. "I need you to be strong," Maya replied. "Because Vincent is going to try to use our family connection to escape consequences for his actions. He's going to claim that this was some kind of misunderstanding, that family loyalty should protect him from prosecution. I need you to choose justice over family, Mum. I need you to stand with the victims of racism, not with the perpetrator." The choice Grace faced was impossible. On one side was Vincent, the man she had loved and trusted for over 2 decades, now facing the destruction of his career and possibly his freedom. On the other side was Maya, her daughter and the embodiment of everything Grace had fought for throughout her life. But Grace Maxwell had not spent 30 years fighting for civil rights to compromise her principles when the stakes became personal. She had not raised her daughter to fight for justice, only to abandon those values when they demanded the ultimate sacrifice. "Maya," Grace said, her voice growing stronger, "I will not let my personal feelings interfere with justice. Vincent made his choice when he decided to embrace racism and violence. Now he has to face the consequences of that choice, even if it destroys our marriage and breaks my heart." The decision would cost Grace everything she had built with Vincent, but it would also define her legacy. She was choosing principle over comfort, justice over family loyalty, the greater good over personal pain. As mother and daughter ended their call, both understood that their family would never be the same. The bonds of love that had sustained them through decades of struggle were about to be tested by forces that neither could have imagined. Vincent Fletcher's racist assault had not just violated Maya's civil rights. It had shattered a family's faith in the power of love to overcome hatred. What happened next would force Grace to make the most painful choice of her life. The confrontation that everyone had been dreading finally took place 5 days later in the federal courthouse, in the same building where similar acts of justice were decided daily. Grace Maxwell walked through the marble halls with her head held high, but her heart was breaking with every step. Vincent was already there, flanked by his police union representative and a criminal defense attorney who had been hired to handle his federal charges. When he saw Grace approaching, his composed facade cracked, revealing the frightened man who had once sought her love and guidance. "Grace," Vincent said, his voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for coming. I knew you wouldn't abandon me." Grace stopped several feet away from him, maintaining a distance that spoke volumes about how their relationship had changed. She looked at the man she had once called her husband, searching for any trace of the person she had thought she had married. "Vincent," she said quietly, "I came here to give you an opportunity to do the right thing, to apologize for what you've done and accept responsibility for your actions." Vincent's attorney, Richard Sullivan, immediately intervened. "Mrs. Fletcher, I've advised my client not to discuss the specifics of the case. Anything he says could be used against him in court." "I'm not talking to your client," Grace replied sharply. "I'm talking to the man I married, the person I trusted with my family, the human being who chose to betray everything I tried to teach him about dignity and respect." The words hit Vincent like physical blows. He had expected Grace to support him, to believe his claims that the incident was a misunderstanding, to use her influence to minimize the consequences of his actions. "Grace, you don't understand," Vincent pleaded. "It wasn't like they're saying. I was just doing my job. I didn't recognize Maya at first, and when things got out of hand, "Stop," Grace interrupted, her voice filled with a pain that silenced everyone in the corridor. "Vincent, I've heard the recordings. I've heard you planning to assault my daughter using language so vile that I can't repeat it. I've heard you expressing hatred for people who look like me, people who look like Maya, people I've spent my life trying to protect." Vincent's face crumpled as he realized that Grace knew everything, not just about the assault, but about the racist ideology that had motivated it. There would be no hiding behind excuses or misunderstandings. "I can change," Vincent said desperately. "I can get help, go to counseling, learn to be better. You always said people could change, that redemption was possible for everyone." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I did say that, Vincent, and I still believe it, but redemption requires genuine repentance, acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and a commitment to making amends. What I see from you is an attempt to escape consequences, not to accept responsibility." The union representative, James Morton, stepped forward. "Mrs. Fletcher, Vincent has been a dedicated officer for 22 years. This incident, while regrettable, shouldn't destroy his entire career and your marriage. Surely there's room for forgiveness and second chances." Grace turned her attention to Morton, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. "Forgiveness? Second chances?" "Mr. Morton, this wasn't Vincent's first incident of racial harassment. This was the culmination of years of racist behavior that was protected and enabled by the very system you represent." She pulled out a folder from her purse, containing copies of the complaint reports that Agent Williams had shared with her. 12 complaints of racial harassment over the past 3 years. 12 people who tried to report Vincent's behavior, only to have their concerns dismissed and buried. How many second chances does one person deserve? The documentation was devastating, providing clear evidence that Vincent's assault on Maya was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of racist behavior that had been systematically ignored. "Mrs. Fletcher," Vincent's attorney interjected, "while these allegations are serious, they don't change the fact that Vincent is your husband. Marriage vows, family loyalty." "Family loyalty?" Grace's voice rose, echoing through the marble corridor. "You want to talk about family loyalty? I showed Vincent loyalty for 22 years. I gave him my love when he had nowhere to turn. I shared my daughter with him, made him part of our family, believed in his capacity for growth and goodness. I taught him values that should have made him a protector of civil rights, not a violator of them." She turned back to Vincent, her voice breaking with emotion. "I gave you everything I had, Vincent. I shared my life with you, trusted you with my daughter's safety, believed in your potential for decency. And you repaid that loyalty by attacking the daughter I raised to fight for justice." Vincent began to cry, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had lost. He had not just committed a crime. He had betrayed the person who had loved him most, destroyed the family that had given him everything, and violated values that had been offered to him as gifts. "Grace, please," Vincent sobbed. "I never meant for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you or Maya. I was angry, confused, influenced by people at work who—" "No," Grace said firmly. "You don't get to blame other people for your choices. You don't get to claim confusion about values I spent 22 years sharing with you. You chose hatred over love, racism over equality, violence over respect. Those were your decisions, Vincent, no one else's." The finality in Grace's voice made it clear that she had made her own choice. She would not sacrifice her principles to protect someone who had rejected them so completely. "Mrs. Fletcher," Vincent's attorney tried one last time. "Surely you can find it in your heart to support Vincent during this difficult time. He needs his family now more than ever." Grace looked at Vincent one final time, memorizing the face of the man she had loved and lost to hatred. "My family is the community of people who fight for justice and equality." Vincent chose to leave that family when he decided to embrace racism and violence. "I will not abandon my true family to protect someone who has abandoned everything I believe in." With those words, Grace Maxwell turned and walked away, leaving Vincent to face the consequences of his choices alone. The sound of her footsteps echoing through the marble corridor was like a funeral dirge for the death of a marriage that had lasted over 2 decades. Behind her, Vincent collapsed into a chair, finally understanding that his racist actions had cost him not just his career and his freedom, but the love of the woman who had tried to save him from becoming exactly what he had chosen to be. But the consequences were just beginning. 8 weeks after Grace's devastating confrontation with Vincent, the wheels of justice began to turn with unprecedented speed and thoroughness. The case of United States vs. Vincent Fletcher had become a landmark prosecution that would reshape how civil rights violations by law enforcement were handled. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen stood before federal judge Patricia Washington in a packed courthouse, preparing to present the government's case against Vincent Fletcher. The evidence was overwhelming, but Chen understood that this case was about more than just one man's racist actions. It was about sending a message that the federal justice system would no longer tolerate or protect institutional racism. Your Honor, Chen began, the evidence in this case is as clear as it is disturbing. The defendant, Commissioner Vincent Fletcher, planned and executed a racially motivated assault on federal prosecutor Maya Maxwell while she was performing her official duties. The assault was premeditated, explicitly racist, and captured on the defendant's own communication device. Chen played the audio recording of Vincent's radio transmission, the racist slurs and threats of violence filling the courtroom with their venom. Several spectators gasped audibly, while others shook their heads in disgust at the explicit nature of Vincent's hatred. This recording, Chen continued, provides irrefutable evidence of the defendant's racist motivations and his intention to use his law enforcement authority to intimidate and assault Ms. Maxwell based solely on her race. Vincent sat at the defense table, his head down, unable to meet the eyes of the spectators who packed the courthouse gallery. His attorney, Richard Sullivan, had advised him that their only option was to negotiate a plea agreement, as the evidence against him was simply too overwhelming to challenge. Judge Washington reviewed the evidence methodically, her expression growing more severe with each revelation. "Mr. Fletcher," she said finally, "you have been charged with violation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. How do you plead?" Vincent stood slowly, his hands shaking as he faced the consequences of his actions. "Guilty, Your Honor." The plea sent ripples through the courtroom. Grace Maxwell, who had attended every hearing despite the personal pain it caused her, closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Justice was being served, but the cost to her family was immeasurable. "Mr. Fletcher," Judge Washington continued, "before I impose sentence, I want you to understand the full scope of what you have done. You didn't just assault Ms. Maxwell, you attacked the very foundations of our justice system. You used your law enforcement authority to perpetrate exactly the kind of racial oppression that our civil rights laws were designed to prevent." Judge Washington's words carried the weight of history, acknowledging that Vincent's crime was not just a personal failing, but a betrayal of the progress that generations of civil rights activists had died to achieve. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "your actions have caused immeasurable pain to your family, particularly Ms. Grace Maxwell, who dedicated her life to fighting the very racism you chose to embrace. Your betrayal of her values and her love represents a particularly cruel dimension of your crimes." Vincent began to sob, finally understanding the full scope of the damage he had caused. He had not just committed a crime, he had broken the heart of the woman who had loved him, destroyed the trust of a family that had welcomed him, and betrayed values that had been offered to him as gifts. "However," Judge Washington said, her tone softening slightly, "I have received a letter from Ms. Grace Maxwell, asking the court to consider the possibility of redemption even in the face of unforgivable actions. She writes that while justice must be served, she still holds hope that you might one day find your way back to the values she tried to teach you." The letter was Grace's final act of love for Vincent, not an attempt to minimize his crimes or escape consequences, but an expression of faith that even someone who had fallen so far might eventually find redemption. "Taking into account the severity of your crimes, the overwhelming evidence of your guilt, and the need to send a clear message about civil rights violations," Judge Washington announced, I sentence you to 6 years in federal prison, followed by 4 years of supervised probation. You are also ordered to pay $750,000 in restitution to Ms. Maxwell for the violation of her civil rights. The sentence was severe but fair, reflecting both the gravity of Vincent's crimes and the possibility of eventual rehabilitation. More importantly, it established a precedent that law enforcement officials who violated civil rights would face serious consequences. But the legal victory was only part of the justice that emerged from the case. The investigation had exposed systemic failures in police administration that had protected Vincent's racist behavior for years. 18 administrators and supervisors were disciplined or fired for their role in ignoring and burying complaints against Vincent. New protocols were implemented requiring mandatory review of all radio communications, immediate investigation of discrimination complaints, and annual civil rights training for all law enforcement personnel. The changes would protect future victims and ensure that racist behavior could not be hidden or ignored. Agent Williams approached Maya after the sentencing hearing. Ms. Maxwell, I wanted you to know that the Justice Department has approved your expanded civil rights investigation for nationwide implementation. Your case, combined with the evidence from Vincent's prosecution, has created unprecedented momentum for police reform. The irony was profound. Vincent's racist assault had inadvertently strengthened the very civil rights initiatives he had tried to disrupt. His actions had provided perfect evidence of the institutional racism that Maya's investigations were designed to address. As the courtroom emptied, Grace Maxwell approached the prosecutor's table where Maya was gathering her files. Mother and daughter embraced, both understanding that justice had been served, but that their family would never fully recover from Vincent's betrayal. I'm proud of you, Grace whispered to Maya. You chose justice over personal comfort, truth over family loyalty. That's what I raised you to do. The validation meant everything to Maya, who had struggled with guilt over prosecuting someone her mother had loved. But Grace's support reminded her that sometimes love requires the courage to hold people accountable for their actions, even when it breaks your heart. What came next would transform the entire system. 1 year after Vincent Fletcher's sentencing, the impact of his case had rippled far beyond the walls of the Chicago Police Department. What had begun as a single incident of racial profiling had evolved into a national reckoning with institutional racism in law enforcement systems across America. Maya Maxwell stood before the House Judiciary Committee, presenting the findings of her expanded civil rights investigation. The briefcase that Vincent had tried to scatter now contained evidence that had transformed American civil rights law. Representatives, Maya began, her voice carrying the authority that came from having survived a racist assault and emerged stronger. The case of United States versus Chicago Police Department has documented systematic civil rights violations affecting over 75,000 citizens across 18 jurisdictions. But more importantly, it has revealed the institutional failures that allow such violations to persist. The hearing room was packed with civil rights advocates, law enforcement officials, and families of victims who had been waiting years for their voices to be heard. Grace Maxwell sat in the front row, her face beaming with pride as she watched her daughter present evidence that would protect countless future victims of police brutality. The reforms we are proposing, Maya continued, include mandatory federal oversight of police departments with documented patterns of racial bias, civilian review boards with investigative authority, and criminal penalties for officials who cover up civil rights violations. Congressman Jerry Nadler leaned forward. Ms. Maxwell, your own experience, being assaulted by a police commissioner while investigating police corruption, has been widely reported. How has that personal experience informed your professional recommendations? Maya paused, thinking about Vincent and the family tragedy that had become a catalyst for national change. Congressman, my experience taught me that racism is not just a series of individual bad decisions. It's a system that protects perpetrators and silences victims. Commissioner Fletcher's assault on me was possible because years of racist behavior had been ignored, enabled and covered up by police administrators. The revelation of the family connection had shocked the public when it first became known, but it had also made the case more powerful. Grace Maxwell's choice to support justice over family loyalty had inspired countless other families to speak out about racism in their own lives. The most important lesson, Maya continued, is that we cannot rely on the goodwill of individuals to combat institutional racism. We need structural changes, legal requirements, and systematic accountability. Love alone is not enough to overcome hatred. We need law enforcement and consequences. Congressman Jim Jordan, the ranking Republican member, questioned the scope of the proposed reforms. Ms. Maxwell, while your experience was obviously traumatic, do you think it's appropriate to use one incident to justify such sweeping changes to law enforcement? Maya's response was immediate and forceful. Congressman, this was not one incident. The investigation revealed 1,247 documented cases of racial harassment by law enforcement officials over the past 3 years, with only 31 resulting in any disciplinary action. Vincent Fletcher was not an aberration. He was a product of a system that tolerates and protects racism. The statistics were devastating, providing undeniable evidence that Vincent's behavior was part of a much larger pattern of institutional failure. The hearing room buzzed with shocked murmurs as representatives processed the scope of the problem. Committee Chairman Gerald Nadler called for order. Ms. Maxwell, what gives you confidence that these reforms will be effective where previous efforts have failed? Because this time we have something we've never had before, Maya replied. We have recorded evidence, documented patterns, and most importantly, we have accountability. Vincent Fletcher is serving 6 years in federal prison. 18 administrators who covered up his behavior have been fired or disciplined. The message is clear: there will be consequences for racism, not protection. The hearing continued for 7 hours, with testimony from victims, law enforcement officials, and civil rights experts. But it was Grace Maxwell's brief statement that provided the most powerful moment of the day. Representatives, Grace said, her voice steady despite the emotion of reliving her family's tragedy. I was married to Vincent Fletcher for 22 years. I tried to teach him about equality and justice. I failed to overcome the racist influences he encountered in law enforcement, but I succeeded in raising Maya to fight for the values that Vincent rejected. Sometimes love requires letting go of those who choose hatred and supporting those who choose justice. Her words captured the essence of the choice facing American society. Continue protecting systems that enable racism, or embrace the difficult but necessary work of creating true accountability and change. 8 months later, the Vincent Fletcher Civil Rights Accountability Act was signed into law, establishing the most comprehensive federal oversight of law enforcement civil rights violations in American history. The law required federal monitoring of police departments with documented racial bias, created independent review boards with subpoena power, and established criminal penalties for officials who covered up civil rights violations. Maya's expanded civil rights investigation resulted in consent decrees with 34 police departments nationwide and over $200 million in settlements for victims. Similar investigations were launched in dozens of other cities, using the legal precedents established by Maya's case. Vincent Fletcher, serving his sentence in federal prison, enrolled in a comprehensive rehabilitation program focused on understanding and overcoming racial hatred. His counselor reported that he was making significant progress, slowly beginning to comprehend the enormity of what he had done to his family and his victims. He had written multiple letters of apology to Maya and Grace, though neither had responded. Grace Maxwell continued her work at the Chicago Community Legal Aid Center, but now she also spoke at conferences about the difficult choice between family loyalty and justice. Her story inspired other families dealing with racism to choose principle over comfort, truth over denial. She had filed for divorce from Vincent and reclaimed her maiden name, but she continued to advocate for rehabilitation and redemption programs in the prison system. What happened in the final transformation would inspire the world. 2 years after the assault that changed everything, Maya Maxwell returned to the Chicago Police Headquarters, not as a victim, but as the newly appointed director of the Federal Civil Rights Division. The building looked the same, but everything else had been transformed. The corridor where Vincent had attacked her now bore a plaque commemorating the civil rights advances that emerged from her case. The inscription read, "Justice requires the courage to hold accountable even those we love, and the wisdom to choose principle over personal comfort." As Maya walked through the headquarters, she was greeted by Captain Elena Rodriguez, who had been promoted to deputy chief following the department's comprehensive reforms. "Director Maxwell," Captain Rodriguez said with genuine warmth, "welcome back. I know this building holds painful memories, but I hope you can also see how much has changed." Maya nodded, observing the diverse group of officers, the new civil rights training materials posted on bulletin boards, and the civilian oversight office that had been established in the wake of Vincent's case. "The changes are remarkable," Maya replied, "but the real test will be whether they're sustained over time. Institutional change requires constant vigilance." As they toured the facilities, Maya reflected on the journey from victim to victor, from personal trauma to systemic change. The briefcase she now carried contained evidence of progress, reformed police departments, new laws and protection for future victims. But the most important change was invisible, a shift in American consciousness about the cost of tolerating racism and the courage required to choose justice over comfort. Vincent Fletcher's racist assault had inadvertently become a catalyst for the very changes he had tried to prevent. That evening, Maya attended a community forum at the Chicago Community Legal Aid Center, where Grace Maxwell was being honored for her decades of civil rights work and her courage in choosing justice over family loyalty. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, "it takes extraordinary strength to stand up for what's right when it costs you everything you hold dear. Grace Maxwell exemplifies the courage required to build a more just society." Grace approached the podium, her hair now silver but her spirit undiminished. "Thank you for this honor," she began, "but I want to be clear about something. I didn't choose between my husband and my daughter. I chose between protecting racism and fighting it. I chose between enabling hatred and supporting justice. Those weren't difficult choices. They were the only choices consistent with the values I've lived by for 60 years. The audience erupted in applause, understanding that Grace's decision had required the ultimate sacrifice, abandoning someone she loved to protect the principles she believed in. "I want to talk about my daughter Maya," Grace continued, her voice filled with pride. "She faced racist violence from someone who should have protected her. She could have chosen silence to preserve family harmony. Instead, she chose truth, justice, and the protection of future victims. That's the kind of courage that changes the world." Maya felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to her mother's words. The validation meant everything, especially coming from someone who had paid such a personal price for supporting justice. "I also want to talk about Vincent," Grace said, surprising the audience. "He made terrible choices that hurt people I love and violated everything I believe in. But he's still serving his sentence, still working on rehabilitation, still trying to understand how he became someone who could harbor such hatred. I don't forgive what he did, but I haven't given up hope that people can change." The complexity of Grace's position, supporting justice while maintaining hope for redemption, captured the nuance required for true healing and progress. After the ceremony, mother and daughter walked together through the Chicago streets, where Grace had organized civil rights protests decades earlier. "Mom," Maya said, "do you ever regret the choice you made? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had supported Vincent instead of justice?" Grace stopped walking and turned to face her daughter. "Maya, baby, I regret that Vincent chose hatred over love. I regret that he rejected 22 years of examples about how to treat people with dignity and respect. I regret that he caused so much pain to people I care about, but I don't regret choosing justice. I don't regret supporting you. I don't regret standing up for what's right." The conversation was interrupted by Maya's phone, which buzzed with a news alert. Federal Civil Rights Division reports historic decline in police misconduct cases following Fletcher Act implementation. Maya showed the headline to her mother, both women understanding that their personal tragedy had contributed to systematic change that would protect thousands of future victims. "Sometimes," Grace said thoughtfully, "the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we do for others. Vincent's racism destroyed our family, but it also created the evidence needed to protect other families from similar violence." As they continued walking, Maya reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in law enforcement systems, but in public consciousness about racism and accountability. The conversation had shifted from whether racism existed to how quickly it could be eliminated. 3 months later, Maya received a letter that had been forwarded through multiple administrative channels. The return address showed it was from Vincent Fletcher at the Federal Correctional Institution, where he was serving his sentence. The letter was brief but significant. Maya, I know you have every right to ignore this letter, and I don't expect forgiveness. I've spent 2 years in therapy, trying to understand how I became someone who could attack his own stepdaughter with racist violence. I still don't have complete answers, but I have some understanding now. I was wrong about everything. Wrong about race, wrong about justice, wrong about what it means to be a good person. Grace tried to teach me better for 22 years, and I rejected every lesson she offered. You dedicated your life to protecting people from racism, and I became exactly the kind of person you fight against. I can't undo what I did, but I can promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of the love Grace showed me, and the mercy you've shown by creating changes that will protect other people from people like me. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, even though I have no right to feel that pride. You've become everything Grace hoped you would be, and everything I failed to become. Vincent. Maya read the letter twice before filing it away. She didn't respond, but she didn't throw it away either. Justice had been served, change had been achieved, but the possibility of redemption, however distant, remained. The legacy of the Fletcher case continued to grow. Law schools taught it as a model of how individual courage could create systemic change. Police academies used it as an example of how racism could destroy careers and harm communities. Families dealing with racist relatives pointed to Grace Maxwell's choice as an example of how love sometimes requires difficult decisions. Maya's work as director of the Federal Civil Rights Division expanded internationally, with other countries requesting assistance in developing their own civil rights enforcement systems. The Fletcher case had become a global symbol of how personal tragedy could be transformed into universal progress. Grace Maxwell, now 70 years old, continued her advocacy work while also serving as a consultant for families dealing with racist relatives. Her message was always the same. Love doesn't require enabling hatred, and supporting justice is sometimes the most loving thing you can do. Vincent Fletcher, with 2 years remaining on his sentence, had become a counselor for other inmates struggling with racist ideologies. His transformation wasn't complete and might never be, but his willingness to confront his own hatred had helped others begin their own journeys toward understanding and redemption. The police headquarters where the assault occurred had been transformed into a national model for civil rights compliance. The corridor where Maya had been attacked was now lined with portraits of civil rights heroes, including one of Grace Maxwell that had been added the previous year. But perhaps the most important transformation was the one that couldn't be measured or quantified. The understanding that racism would no longer be tolerated, that victims would be believed, and that justice would be pursued regardless of personal cost. Maya Maxwell had entered that police headquarters as a federal prosecutor investigating corruption. She left as a crime victim who had been failed by the system, but she returned as a leader who had transformed that system into something better, stronger, and more just. Sometimes, she reflected, justice emerges not despite personal tragedy, but because of it. The family that Vincent had betrayed had become stronger, the system he had corrupted had been reformed, and the values he had rejected had ultimately triumphed. The transformation was complete, but the work of justice would continue forever. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.